We all want clean water, an abundance of natural wildlife, and a healthy and natural ecosystem for our children and their children to enjoy. But who benefits, and who pays the price? Recently, a number of agriculture and environmental groups came together to examine these and many other important issues. Join us as we examine the social and economic value of Saskatchewan's natural capital.
While we're waiting for the last of the coffee fill-ups there, I'll take this opportunity to introduce myself. My name is Dennis Sherritt. I'm from the Canadian Plains Research Centre. I'm your moderator for the next day and a half of the conference. I'm very pleased to be here. I want to, as I said, welcome the Saskatchewan participants, but I also want to welcome the participants that come from our neighboring provinces, and in fact, even as far away as Ontario. To open the conference, I would like to introduce Elizabeth Quashie, who has considerable experience both from the technical and executive levels in the area of energy, utilities, and mining, where she specialized in environmental impact assessment, audit, and corporate social responsibility. If you go into her bio, you can read, and it's very, very extensive, very well qualified for this. But most important, she is currently the Deputy Minister of Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment, which has the responsibility, amongst several other things, but for climate change, environmental impact assessment, environmental protection, resource management, and small engine repair? No, maybe not. The portfolio is very, very broad, and I personally want to thank her for taking time out of her busy schedule to come here and provide some opening remarks. Elizabeth, please.
Thank you so much for your very kind introductory remarks. I think people know me as being able to do many things, but I don't think anybody has attached small engine repair to my portfolio or knowledge base yet. First of all, thank you for that kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today on behalf of the Minister of Environment, the Honorable Nancy Hepner. She sends her regrets for not being here today. In our ministry, we manage and we protect Saskatchewan's long-term capital, and that is our focus on a daily basis. And I'm happy to say that we have dedicated and knowledgeable staff, some of whom are here today, and I'm very proud to work with them, and I learn a lot from them on a daily basis. I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to welcome everyone to the symposium. We make a link between our economy and the value of Saskatchewan's ecological goods and services. And I think this is really well worth talking about. Ecological goods and services are new and exciting, and it's a good way to describe and value the contributions that we make to our natural ecosystems and their natural capital. We understand that biodiversity contributes to keeping ecological systems in harmony. Diversity is also what economists recommend for a healthy, stable economy. So that shows the linkage that we have between environment and economy. Saskatchewan's approach to ecological goods and services is equally diverse. We are fortunate in this wonderful province to have people who have a history of innovative thinking when it comes to the environment. And I'll just list a few, even though they may not be directly on point with respect to ecological value. We are a world leader in carbon dioxide capture and sequestration technologies. We have Canada's largest university-based lab for water toxicology research. Saskatchewan was the first in Canada to mandate the use of ethanol, and we are early innovators in farming methods that help conserve the land. We may be small, but we have strength and might and thinking. While these initiatives do not speak directly to ecological goods and services, they do speak to a willingness to innovate and to lead change. We already recognize that good stewardship and conservation and land management by private landowners through the use of conservation easements is really important. Currently, we have 1,985 land parcels protected in a total of over 81,000 hectares, which we manage in Saskatchewan through conservation easements. The ministry recognizes the significant role that conservation organizations play, and some of you are here today, and I look forward to chatting with you further. We have played a significant role in establishing and managing these conservation easements. And as you participate in today's discussion, I hope you will encourage each other to identify new opportunities to help build a natural capital. Your ideas and concerns will ultimately help shape and help us in developing and innovating a made-in-Saskatchewan approach to sustaining our natural capital. Saskatchewan is blessed incredibly with diverse natural resources that are the envy of the world. Our shared responsibility is to ensure that they are there for not just us, but also for future generations. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you this morning, and I wish you a great and successful symposium. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz, for those opening remarks. Very much appreciated, and you're right. Saskatchewan is the envy of the world, and I've got to tell you that our next speaker this morning and welcoming host is doing it on behalf of both conservation and agricultural organizations who have been able to come together in a common theme around ecological goods and services. Ray is a farmer, he's a rancher, he's an electrical contractor, he's a conservationist, and oh, did I mention in his spare time, he's president of the Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation. So on behalf of all the host agencies, I would like to welcome Ray, first of all, to the conference, but also to say a few remarks.
Thanks, Dennis. Yeah. Welcome, everybody. It's a nice wintry day here. It seems like 300 days in a row we've had winter. I know I'm in Calvin, and I keep backing it up, and I'm thinking that I'm going to back it up some more this year. Saskatchewan Wildlife Federation is very pleased and honored to be involved as hosts of this symposium with our partnering organizations, APAS and Ducks Unlimited. Our federation is proud to represent 28,000 members from 121 branches across the province, predominantly from rural Saskatchewan. Only 6% of our membership is from Saskatoon and Regina. Our mission statement is to ensure that the wildlife legacy we leave to our children surpasses that which we inherited. And I'm personally, as Dennis mentioned, a rancher and farmer, and that the majority of our board members are landowners. And when I look at this and I say farmer and rancher, I sort of, what really am I? And it brings me to a story. My brother and I were hunting. We were out at Maple Creek, and we went to a coffee shop there, and there were some old ranchers. I'm going to say ranchers. We're sitting in there, and we got talking, and they said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a farmer. I run some cows. And the guy looks at me and he says, well, how many cows do you run? Do you run like 10 cows or 50 cows? And I said, no, I'm over 100 cows. And he says, oh, you're not a farmer, you're a rancher. So anyways, I still think about that. If you go to Maple Creek, you're a rancher. If you go to Yorkton, you're a farmer. So we're very aware of the public benefits that good stewardship by Saskatchewan landowners provide us all, and we're committed to support this initiative. We're confident that through an open exchange of ideas and initiatives over the next 2 days, we can create the cornerstone for a comprehensive Made in Saskatchewan EGS program that'll benefit all of Saskatchewan today and for generations to come. For myself, I hope and I think that it'll be very informative. I have a vested interest, the same as every other landowner in a province. And with that, I'll say enjoy your symposium. Thank you.
I want to take a couple of minutes now to provide a little context around natural capital and the concepts of EGS. We're going to touch on that aspect only briefly in this conference. I think it's been done in a number of other areas, in a number of other conferences in terms of discussion about the value of EGS. This is more about the pragmatic side. This conference is more about the pragmatic side of opportunities and commodities that agriculturalists may be interested in. We, as I said, we want to spend the next couple days or day and a half looking at why it's important, but I would even suggest from an ecological point of view that this approach will be critical for the sustainable use of our landscapes in the long run, and that sustainable use should be recognized by society. Ecosystem services, of course, are so pervasive, they're so large in scale that it's hard to imagine that human activities could change them, alter them, or destroy them. Many of these services are seemingly free, and they've been treated as free, but their value is almost incalculable in terms of economic return to society. It's because they are so fundamental to us that they've been largely taken for granted, and I think in some areas are becoming threatened. Goods and services provided to mankind by natural ecosystems and the plants and animals within them would be very difficult, if not impossible, to recreate. That's nothing new for the folks in this room. I know you realize that. This sort of message, though, is getting out to society, and I think it bears repeating. At a finer scale, the value of ecological goods and services are beginning to be recognized actually in a variety of land programs in Canada, also the United States, and even, of course, throughout Europe. Canadian farmers or landowners may be able to be engaged in production of ecological goods and services, one of which, of course, is carbon sequestration, which is kind of sneaking out and is going to be, I think, separated by its economic value within the suite of ecological goods and services. And in fact, it may drive the particular program. I also think it's important, by the way, that in terms of the valuation of these services, that they are stackable, that each value is additive in terms of what it returns to society. And I'm sure there will be discussion on that as the next day and a half moves on. Can farmers, can there be a rural-urban partnership formed? Well, certainly in many areas of Canada, that's already been shown to be a very positive partnership. And I'm sure we'll see examples of that over the next day and a half. EGS is a moving target. However, pilot projects are providing key information on an ongoing basis. They look at the best approach and the opportunities with respect to this most valuable commodity, or commodities, as the case may be. What we want to view today with a critical eye and tomorrow is, so what has happened and what are the lessons learned? Ray spoke to a Made in Saskatchewan process. Yep, but we'll take what other people have learned and hopefully add to it. And I know there's a lot going on, and as I say, I'm actually very, very excited about hearing what's happened, of course, in Manitoba, in Ontario, in a number of areas, and the discussion in the next day and a half. To start off the process, we've invited Dr. Paul James to come and set EG&S into context with respect to natural capital and programming. Paul, of course, received his doctorate from Oxford, and you'll recognize by the twang in his voice that he's not from around here, but I will tell you that the one thing Paul has discovered is the Canadian prairies, and has made this his home for some time, and I believe wants to stay here for a while. Paul will take us through, as I said, the natural capital process of EG&S and the valuation of it in broad conceptual terms, and basically set the stage for this afternoon's discussions. But anyway, Paul, I told you I wouldn't embarrass you. Without further ado, Paul James.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you to the organizers for having me along today just to chat a little bit about one of the subjects I find extremely interesting and extremely intellectually stimulating. This first slide, you can see it, I think, well enough for now. It just really gives an overview of some of the areas I'm going to touch on. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I think it's more important for the dialogue to begin among us in order to create, possibly a framework, possibly a momentum in order to start this program or start a program like this within Saskatchewan. I'm a big fan of ecological goods and services and their recognition within the greater economy. I think it's long overdue for a variety of reasons, and I also think that it's a win-win-win-win-win situation. The environment wins, the economy wins, society wins. So at risk, taking the risk to bore you somewhat, because I know lots of you guys are far more expert at this than I am going to talk a little bit about what EG&S are, ecological goods and services, why they're important to value, who benefits from their valuation, including who should be benefiting from the valuation, where and how they're being valued, and I won't go into a lot of detail there because I think that's really going to be the foundation of a lot of the discussion in the next couple of days. Then I'll sort of cast forward in time a little bit and think about and maybe present a vision of what EG&S program is going to look like in the future as they're born and as they're reborn across the country and particularly in Saskatchewan. All right, so what are ecological goods and services? I've sort of split them into goods and services because I think it's important to think about the processes that create goods and the goods, so to speak, that we consume as human beings. So for that reason, I've included food. Now, most people don't think of food as being an ecological good, but in fact it is. It's derived from photosynthesis, and it's derived from soils, and it's derived from water, etc. Crops, livestock, timber and fiber, things like cotton and the clothes we wear. Obviously, clean water is a good, healthy air, fertile soil, fish and wildlife, and I've also added as biodiversity as a kind of a throw-in thing. All of these are goods that we need to a large extent, in fact to a very large extent. The things that produce those goods are listed on the right-hand side, and that's by no means an exhaustive list, but it runs all the way from photosynthesis, the ability of green leaves to photosynthesize, capture carbon and reorganize it in a form that's useful, not only for us but for other species. Water purification, of course, wetlands, thank you. Wetlands provide a very important role in purifying water. Flood control, air quality regulation, carbon sequestration, which I'll talk a little bit more later on. Erosion control, decomposition, detoxification, etc., etc., etc. Pollination, which I'll also talk about in a moment when I talk about honeybees. All of these things are going on, and they are critical to the production of goods that we need. The other part of that slide mentioned, and Dennis has already touched on it, the words natural capital. Ecological goods and services can also be considered as natural capital. Why are they important to value? They're critical to long-term human well-being. And I think I just demonstrated that, but there are many, many ways of thinking about that. If we don't have them, then we are putting ourselves at risk, quite frankly. Ecological goods and services have largely been taken for granted until recently, and by that I mean that they are basically considered as being free. And the problem with having free things is that people tend to abuse free things. And when you don't value something, you tend to abuse it. And so that leads to my third point, that in fact ecological goods and services have been under siege for a good time now by human beings, and we've lost a lot at a non-sustainable rate and are still continuing to do so. There are other factors there, of course, other than the fact that they're largely free. We have a very large human population and it's growing exponentially on the planet, and it's putting a lot of pressure on natural systems. When we lose ecological goods and services, we're finding that they're very expensive to duplicate or replace. And I'll touch on an example of that in a moment when I talk about honeybees. And in fact, it may be impossible to replace some of them. We tend to be very good with technology as a species and substituting technological solutions to problems. But in fact, many of these things are likely impossible to replace. For example, I mentioned photosynthesis and the marvelous thing that chloroplasts do in the green leaves. It's hard to imagine trying to engineer something like that from scratch and have it work at the same efficiency as that particular thing does that's been honed over millions of years of evolutionary selection. I just had there's a quiz, by the way, in my talk. This is only one question quiz, so if you know the answer to the question is, what is the green stuff in that picture? If you know the answer, and I'm talking about the whole landscape, if you know the answer, scribble it on a piece of paper with your name and put it in the back corner. There's a box there, because I don't know what it is and I've forgotten what it is. Lots of white out there. Okay. Let's move on to an example of what I'm really talking about in terms of loss and substitutability, and that is honeybee economics, and what they do for us is pollination. There's over 150 food crops in North America that require pollination. Many of those we grow in Canada, canola being a prime one, flax, for example, and others. The pollination of crops in the United States alone is worth about $14 billion a year. And the honeybee's contribution is estimated to be about $8 billion a year. So it's by far and away the most important pollinator in our natural environment. Wild honeybees, unfortunately, despite this and despite their importance, wild honeybees have declined 25% over the last 25 years. And the substitute that we've used to replace that natural pollination, the domestic honeybees, have also declined 50% since 1945, due to different reasons. The wild honeybees are mostly declining because of habitat loss, I would argue, possibly also things like pesticides. The domestic honeybees are declining because of disease issues mainly, I believe. I'm not an apiarist, but that's my understanding. So continuing declines in these pollinators is, and this is the outcome of this really, leads to greater food costs and of course disrupted ecosystems. I think that's a very a powerful example of what we stand to gain, and in fact what we stand to lose and what we stand to gain by taking ecological goods and services seriously and valuing them instead of taking them for granted. So in a nutshell, what programs, EGS programs do is take us from the vision, if you like, on the left to the vision on the right. We're often told that sustainability resides in the left-hand diagram there at the intersection of the environment and the economy. Sometimes the people also throw society or social things in there too. And that the overlap really is the key to sustainability. And I call that weak sustainability for a number of reasons, mostly because in fact, it's a fallacy, and in fact, on the right-hand side is really the true situation, as I've tried to just illustrate. The human economy is a subset of the natural environment and is dependent on the natural environment. So it's much more realistic to think about the human economy as being embedded within a greater economy, if you like, that we then convert. We take those products, goods and services, we convert them into the things that we need as a species or want as a species. So EGS programming at its core takes us from the vision on the left to the vision on the right. When we value EGS, we move what I consider into a situation that reflects the true situation ecologically on the planet or within Saskatchewan. and that is that the human economy is indeed embedded and dependent on the greater ecosystem. Moving on, who benefits? To date, as I said, because these things have largely been taken for granted and free, we all benefit, okay, in terms of society at large. However, during this process, you know, there have been a lot of producers, and I've worked with many of them, who work hard and have worked hard to, you know, save a few acres here, save a few acres there, graze their lands in a sustainable fashion, etc. And the costs of maintaining those services are borne by them and them alone. Okay, and that's an inequity that needs to be addressed, and it is addressed in an EGS program, or should be. I think in the future, if these programs are more widely adopted, and I think they need to be, then producers are going to be finally recognized and compensated by society for their efforts in conserving and building ecological goods and services. Is there support to do this? This data is taken from a recent survey where people were asked, you know, are you willing, or should producers be paid to produce environmental services on their land? And you can see that the majority either say yes or maybe, whether they're on the farm, non-farm, rural, or in urban areas. It's interesting that in urban areas, the support, there's a lot more maybes, and that's probably because I think people don't quite understand it as well as rural people do. But really, it's a resounding yes. People, society, taxpayers, if you like, seem to be prepared to pay producers for these critical things. Moving on again, how and where, or where and how, are they being valued at the moment? There are EGS programs of various stripes and colors, etc. in Europe, Australia, the United States, and Canada. Manitoba, Ontario, and PEI, I think, are the three provinces that have them at the moment. Others have sort of played with it a little bit and considering it. At its very simplest, you know, concept, and I'm not going to go on about this because other people who are much more expert will, but the whole idea is basically you compensate producers for retaining, let's call them natural areas, whether they're wetlands or uplands, that provide ecological goods and services. That's the very sort of core of the thing. I'm going to touch on two examples. One, the New York City water supply example, which some of you have probably heard of before. And I'm going to come a little bit close to home and have a look at the Manitoba program that's called ALICE, Alternative Land Use Systems, I think it is. Yep. Look at those two briefly. And it's a good illustration of substitutability, if you like. The city of New York has 9 million people, so it's 9 times the population of Saskatchewan, packed into a very, very small area. These people need a lot of water, and obviously it's got to be clean. And the government was faced with the issue of, well, how are we going to do this, and how are we going to maintain a clean water supply? And their two choices were basically to spend $8 billion on water treatment plants, or spend $2 billion or $1.6 billion paying those people that live in these watersheds, the green areas shown there on the right, to maintain ecological goods and services on their lands. They opted for the latter, and it's become a very, very successful program, and I think demonstrates clearly the value of turning this thing around, and not necessarily immediately going to the technological fix, but by going to let's call it the natural fix, if you like. Moving closer to home, in Manitoba, the EGS program there, I think, is coming to an end, or has come to an end. It was a pilot project, and I hope that it is reborn again and continues on. But basically, the idea there is that landowners, again, are compensated for retaining some lands, natural areas on their property. They basically divide their categories into 4. There's riparian buffers, which of course are critical in terms of stream quality, water quality, and controlling things like erosion. Wetlands, of course, which play an important role in water purification, flood control, etc. What they call natural areas, which I think is, you know, aspen stands and things like that, grassland areas that are retained. And they've also got a category called ecologically sensitive areas. And they pay their producers who enroll in these systems different amounts of money per acre for retaining these areas. I did want to make one point about the Manitoba ALICE program. At the risk of offending them, it's just my own personal perspective here, because I know that the program is going to be revived, I hope, or continued anyway. But I want you to pay attention to the fact that no use is paid at a higher rate than use. And I think that if you actually think about that for a moment, that may not be necessarily the best way to think about this, because when you remove use, you remove some kind of disturbance. And ecosystems need disturbance in order to maintain their ecological integrity. So let's think about cattle grazing for a moment. And I've got a picture down there of some cattle munching away somewhere on some looks like tame grassland, but in the background there's some native grassland. And quite frankly, it's just not a good idea to remove cattle entirely from native grassland, because you're going to lose other values that are also important. For example, biodiversity. These grassland systems have evolved with the disturbance of grazing, and it is important that they continue to be disturbed in a sustainable way, of course, in terms of moderate grazing. So I think that it's important to think about that. You might also think, another example might be aspen bluffs. Aspen does need to be disturbed in order to regenerate. You can either cut aspen and it regenerates, or you burn aspen and it regenerates. But just walk away and leave the aspen stand and claim that it's somehow doing some good, which it is, of course, at some point, but further down the road, the aspen is going to die, fall down, you're just left with a big pile of shrub, probably. So you do have to think about management when you think about EG&S, and just assuming that no use are somehow worth less money, I think is fundamentally wrong. I know it complicates these programs, but I think it's something that needs to be built into the new programs as they come on stream. Let's talk about the future a little bit. You could think about EG&S as you know, as money growing on trees, right? Let's call it that. In trees, yeah. But in fact, I think the future is going to take us another step further in EG&S, and that is, in fact, that EG&S is going to be making money for producers out of thin air, quite literally. And that's in the area of carbon sequestration. And I'd like to return to that and consider what effect that's going to have on EG&S programs and their design and implementation across the country. Carbon sequestration, of course, is not a new thing in terms of its being recognized. Here's an illustration here of the amount of carbon that's been sequestered in Saskatchewan's cropland soils for the good reason of rebuilding their fertility, so that farmers are left less reliant on artificial fertilizers. And groups like the Saskatchewan Soil Conservation Association have done an excellent job in promoting conservation tillage that does rebuild the integrity of these soils. So it's not a new thing, but this is talking about cropland ecosystems. But of course, as we know, other ecosystems sequester carbon: wetlands, grasslands, and forest. And I've just shown here a really simplified carbon cycle, just to I suppose get you to think about, you know, flows and stocks. When carbon moves through that system, we call it a flux, and when it's stored, we call it a sink or a reservoir of carbon. We have big reservoirs in the oceans, of course. They sequester a lot of carbon, and plants and vegetation, of course, sequester carbon. They take carbon in and release oxygen. Animals do the opposite. But the important point about this illustration is the human part and how we fit into this carbon cycle. What human beings have done over the last 100 years or so is taken a lot of stored carbon in the form of fossil fuels, used it to drive our economy, and then released it mostly in the form of carbon dioxide, but also other things like methane. which have created what some people think is an extremely serious issue, and that is climate change and the consequences of climate change. Climate change has become a hot topic politically, especially I think in recent months, but let me just talk a little bit about the Canadian government's response to climate change as it stands right now, and link it to ecological goods and services programs. The current goal of the federal government is to reduce 2006 greenhouse gas emissions by 20% by 2020. They have 4 mechanisms to do that, which I won't bore you with, but one of them that links directly to EGS programming is a thing called a National Domestic Offset System that recognizes carbon sequestration in reduction projects, carbon reduction projects. Basically, an offset system works like this. I mean, there are two really, but if we go back to that carbon cycle, there are 2 ways you can remove carbon. You can stop it going out the chimneys at a rate they are, or you reduce the rate it's released, or you facilitate its uptake in ecosystems. Or, of course, as the deputy pointed out, we can also capture it and store it underground. So, I mean, there are technological fixes. They are expensive, though, extremely expensive. That's basically what an offset system is. It's a way of companies offsetting their emissions by recognizing or paying for, or whatever mechanism, the value of natural ecosystems that sequester carbon. And for some reason, part of that slide didn't come up, but that's fine. Since the US election, the Canadian government has been talking to the Americans quite a bit, and they're seeking a bilateral approach. So I think they're trying to create a unified, which of course I think is sensible, approach to climate change across North America that includes carbon offsets and carbon credit trading that will give a major boost, I think, to future EGS programs. Okay, the link in all of this stuff is the thing called the carbon credit. And the carbon credit has been defined not just by us, but by others in the world as a ton of carbon removed, a TONNE, a metric ton of carbon dioxide or equivalent emissions reduced or removed from the air. That's one carbon credit. And the vision in Canada at the moment, anyway, is that carbon credits, it's going to be somewhat regulated and not loosey-goosey, and I think it's important to a point to do that. Carbon credits are going to be issued by Environment Canada to proponents for eligible reductions, greenhouse gas reductions and removals achieved from an offset project. And again, I put in the background there the pictures of the smokestacks and the pictures of the ecosystem, natural ecosystem. So on the one hand, you have the sort of the emitters, if you like, which you can reduce through technology, etc., or carbon storage, capture and storage. And of course, we have our natural ecosystems which are removing those things. Offset credits are going to be generated from emission reductions that take place outside of regulated activities. So I think the federal government right now is envisaging saying to the large emitters of Canada, okay, we need a target from you. I don't know how they'll achieve this agreement, but they're going to obviously have to talk to companies, come up with a target reduction, and companies, I think, are going to be tasked to making those reductions. If they make them, if they do it really well and they actually do better than they expected, they're going to be given carbon credits to do that. For doing that, those carbon credits are going to be then tradable on climate exchanges, of which there are 4 in the world right now. A new one opened last week in China. I'll talk about those in a second. Those carbon credits can then be traded around. Projects must be in Canada, which of course makes sense. They must be incremental. In other words, they've got to create additional carbon capture, and they've got to be verified. So in other words, it's not, well, I think this. There has to be a scientific basis for this, and it has to be defendable, which of course makes sense. Offsets credits can be bankable and tradable on climate exchanges, as I already mentioned, and there's unlimited use of offset credits for compliance. So companies can make efforts internally for energy efficiencies, et cetera, reduce greenhouse gas emissions that way. But they'll also have the ability to use use offset credits to meet their goals. How is the federal government proposing to treat these biological carbon sinks? They'll either remove them from the atmosphere and store them in sinks, or will avoid emitting greenhouse gases to the atmosphere from a reservoir. So that's important. The way I read that is I think the federal government is envisaging protecting, quote unquote, or ensuring the conservation of existing reservoirs. So one of the huge reservoirs in Saskatchewan is a native grassland, the remaining native grasslands of Saskatchewan, which can hold, well, I've seen various numbers, but some of the ancient grasslands, as I call them in the United States, that have been there for, well, since the last glaciation, hold 100 tons of carbon per hectare. Huge amounts of carbon that are in these reservoirs, and we need to not release that. So this has to be important. So you can see the link already to the conservation way of thinking, okay? So they'll either remove them from the atmosphere or they'll avoid emitting greenhouse gases. Forests. This can take the form of forests. So afforestation, regrowing forests that used to be there. Reforestation, obviously, avoided reduced reforestation, forest management. In agriculture, they're looking at things like conservation tillage, obviously, and I've already spoken about that. And I think farmers are already being or can be compensated for storing carbon in their croplands. Crop rotations and grazing that sequester more carbon in the soil, things like permanent cover programs. It's notable that these things apparently are going to be allowed to seek registration more than once. And usually the contracts on these things are 3 to 5 years, and then you can renew them. This is just an overview. I encourage you, if you need to know more, to go to the Environment Canada website, and the whole thing is laid out in way too much language, as usual. What's carbon worth then, in terms of carbon credits right now? These are the trading prices that I came across this week. There are 4 exchanges, as I mentioned: Montreal, Chicago, Europe, which is the oldest, and a new one that opened last week in Tianjin in China. I wasn't able to get a value for that. I don't think they're actively trading at this point. But the prices right now are ranging from $2, this is Canadian dollars, $2 to $18 per ton. So each carbon credit is worth between $2 and $18. So let's go back and ask the question, so what is that, how does that compare to EGS programming, as it stands at the moment? The way you do that, of course, is to ask the question, well, how much area does it take to create a carbon credit? And then you've got the same comparison. And I picked Aspen because it's easy. I'm lazy, but I picked Aspen. But in this part of the world, it takes about an acre of aspen to sequester 1 ton of carbon a year. So it takes an acre of aspen about a year to make you a carbon credit, more or less. And if we then go to the thing I showed you before, the payment schedule, and this time focus in on the category natural, which I think is intended to capture things like aspen bluffs and things like that. And we go to no use, just for argument's sake, which is the highest payment, where producers are being paid $15 per acre for aspen. So the carbon markets, as I just showed you right now, are trading carbon at $2 to $18 per acre. And in the bottom right-hand corner there, I show you the historical trend of the Chicago Climate Exchange. It's the green line, price of carbon. Obviously, it goes up and down like any other market, and right now it's depressed like any other market. But it's been as high as $7, and it's now trading at around $2. But historical highs for all of the markets, for the 3 that have been operating for some time, fall between $7 and $54 per acre of aspen, or per carbon credit. So you can see, compared to our $15 that are being paid per producers, that carbon sequestration is already, or even at lows, has a large, it represents a large proportion of the payment to producers. So I think that that's another consideration that's going to have to be brought into the redesign of EGS programs in the future. The neat thing about this, of course, is that it's a market-driven system, which of course has its other issues. So this sort of thing doesn't necessarily require government money. People are willing to pay you for this stuff. So in conclusion then, I think 4 points. EGS programs, I believe, are critical in promoting sustainable land management. I think they're a cornerstone, as Dennis has already mentioned. Canadian programs have gained a foothold, but I think now is the time to adopt them more broadly. And I think that the EGS programs of the future are going to be much more carbon-centric, although, of course, that brings its own issues with it, because, again, you don't want to manage lands necessarily only for carbon production, right? We want to maintain all of those services and goods that nature provides us. And that's all I have. Thank you. Thanks for listening.
We've purposely given some time this morning, first of all, for questions of Paul or perhaps any of the speakers, but I'll control it a little bit here, folks. With that, are there any comments or questions on Paul's presentation?
Okay, thanks, Paul. I just had a question with respect to stepping back from maybe the program aspect of EGS and thinking about the public policy objectives, which I think is an important part of this symposium over the next couple days. You talked about the inequity of public versus private goods, but overall, what do you think the public policy objective should be? Should it be addressing that inequity, or should it be an income, addressing some of the farm income issues, or addressing purely environmental issues, and sort of stepping back from that program? Because as we heard, and I'm sure we'll hear over the next few days, there's a multitude of ways we can provide that compensation to landowners once we figure out what that objective overall is. So just a comment would be appreciated.
I'm not sure if I'm going to answer your question, but I think it's important. I think the environmental stuff will take care of itself. You've got to fix, you know, the fact, and it is I think a great disparity, the fact that there are many people that work on the land and they're not paid for what they do. And that, you know, I don't know if that's a policy issue or not. You know, maybe Liz might comment on that. But I think it's critical to recognize that's the core thing. And I think everything else will follow from there. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we've lost so much of our EGS is because the producers just can't, you know, I mean, obviously someone probably don't care, but, you know, I think that's the majority, minority, quite frankly. In my experience, most agricultural producers in this province do care, you know. But I mean, they've got to put food on the table, and at the end of the day, and you know, we all know what's going to go first. And if you help them put food on the table with adequate compensation, then I think the environmental problems will take care of themselves. Where the money comes from, of course, is the difficult thing, and I think that carbon sequestration, I think, offers some hope here because it's going to carry, I think, most of the burden, or should carry most of the burden. But I think that it's not fair, again, for society who largely benefits from this thing to not have to pay in some form. And again, we can talk all day about how that happens. But the government has to, I think, be involved, certainly at the beginning, quite heavily. I think this is a great opportunity, too, by the way, of departments like agriculture and environment to work much more closely together. You know, I spent 21 years in the civil service, and there was way too much, you know, conflict between those two departments. This provides a common ground and a common purpose and a common language to achieve the things that both, you know, departments want. So I think there's actually potentially a major impact in terms of policy there and the way that departments work together.
Good morning, Ian Wisher with Keystone Ag Producers, and you know that I'm very familiar with Alice. I do appreciate your comments. We've come to recognize as well that perhaps we didn't have the values in the right proportion. I guess in our defense, we designed this in 1999. A few things have changed since 1999, but our intention has always been that this is a working landscape model, and what we endeavored to do with the differential payments was to share the value. Perhaps we didn't have the emphasis right. Certainly we didn't know as much about carbon sequestration and nutrient cycling then as we do now. So I suspect that if we had to design it again, we would probably reverse or invert some of those values in a significant way. But just comment on the last question, whether this is an environmental program or a farm income program, which is often the argument we get into depending on which audience you're talking to. I don't actually view them as mutually exclusive. And I think it's time. And I think that's the real challenge, not only for us as farmers, but for the bureaucrats and politicians that want to talk about this, is to take the blinders off and realize that you can create a green economy, of which agriculture has always been part, and build on that. And this is all part of that whole process. You can fix two things with the same dollar. And frankly, from a government perspective, this should be something that they really want to do. Very seldom do they get even offered the opportunity to do that. And we've done some cost-benefit analysis as our pilot project, and I know a few others have as well. And the ratios are phenomenal. Government should be hugely excited about, on the average in our project, we were looking at 50-to-1 benefit-cost ratios. You don't get offered those kind of projects very often, especially ones that actually, as you pointed out, have some significant social impact in rural communities. So I don't disagree with your comments and criticisms on Alice. I think, in fact, we come to much the same conclusion. And I certainly appreciated some of your opening comments there. Thank you.
Yeah, well, yeah, and again, I didn't mean to be critical, because obviously you got to start somewhere, and that's the other point. As a scientist now, I'd like to comment on this. Scientists have a horrible habit of, not being able to make a decision, either a yes or no decision. They tend to give you a lot of probabilities, and to me, it's more important to say, okay, we're going to go with this, and the value is going to be this. It has to be adaptive. As you get more information, you've got to adapt to a changing situation, which I think is where you were going there. But I mean, hats off to you for doing it and working through it. It's good stuff.
Hi, my name is Bob Bailey, and I'm with Delta Waterfowl and have been involved with the Alice projects right across the country. I want to speak to the issue that you raised in terms of policy and where do we go and how do we reward farmers for their contribution to environmental goods and services. I'd like to introduce a fairly controversial element into that, which is, in reality, the way that we have been doing that in many places from coast to coast right now has not been rewarding farmers, but regulating them and regulating the supply and the delivery of ecological goods and services on their land. And Alice and EGS programs offer an alternative to that. And we've seen that situation, for example, really in its extreme in provinces like Prince Edward Island, where everybody can recall the scenes of fish kills on the national news and the need to do something in there. And as it turns out, actually, the province of Prince Edward Island has now adopted Alice as a program. And they're finding right now preliminarily that it's really meeting their needs. They have not lost their base of regulation, of reasonable regulation, but they've added payments for ecological goods and services to that paradigm.
Yeah, that's a good point, Bob. And I think that, it's my understanding that the Saskatchewan government is in fact undergoing a process, rejigging, if you like, in terms of moving away from regulation and moving towards more sort of results-based type approaches. And of course, EGS programming fits perfectly into that category, as you just pointed out.
Good morning, Norm Hall, Environment Committee of APAS. We've been talking about an endangered species, and if you know the definition of endangered species, it's the number of breeding pairs on the land. And the average age of Saskatchewan farmers between 55 and 60. There's not too many breeding pairs left. So one thing we have to work on is bringing more farmers onto the land so that you can pay them to keep the environment. But one of the quickest ways to ruin an environment is through poverty. And you look at third world countries and what they've done to their environment. And And you look around Saskatchewan, and farmers are trying to get the most they can out of their land. They're doing everything they can. And if you want to save it, we're going to have to be paid to leave that slough in. We're going to have to be paid to leave the bush in place. Because with inputs increasing the way they are, we're finding it more and more expensive to work around these things and leave them. And Ms. Quarshie, the Department of Environment in Saskatchewan are doing their regulatory review. It's very good timing with this conference. Hopefully we can have some influence on the direction that you're going. Bob from Delta mentioned the PEI Alice project. I was in contact with a PEI dairy farmer last week. He said it's an excellent program, just not rich enough because their land values are so much higher than what we're used to out here that it's not quite meeting the rent, but you know, it's a start, and that's where we have to go.
Hi, I'm Pete Joyce. I'm with PFRA&E here in Regina with Ag Canada. I guess a comment from me and a question. I just wanted to recognize in my own experience, I've been working on the EGS file for our department for some time now. It appears to me that there's a lot of activities that are going on in the form of conservation programs and various initiatives that provide recognition and reward to producers for actions that give rise to ecosystem services. Things like paid conservation easements, the Eco-Gifts program, our National Farm Stewardship programming, the North American Waterfall Management Plan and incentives connected with that. I think we need to recognize that it isn't one program or one thing, perhaps, that's going to get the job done. It's probably going to be a suite of things. And so I guess the question to you is, can you comment on some of those other initiatives that are going on and how they fit? You've mentioned carbon, and I think that's very important. And the suggestion I'd make is we might want to think about talking about markets as much as we talk about programs, quote unquote. And the challenge to us is, how do we get to internalizing ecosystem services in the market system and get to that picture that you had up there with the economy inside the circle of the environment. So I'll leave it to you to comment on that.
Okay. To me, I mean, I think that EGS not only can be a program, it's actually a way of thinking. And if you take that analytical perspective and apply it to existing programs, you now have an acid test, I would argue. And I think that programs that take us further to rebuilding, building, maintaining, conserving the things that lead to a healthy landscape, not only for producers that live there and produce the goods that we need, but also for greater society, are the programs that should be retained. And quite frankly, programs that do the opposite should be eliminated. That's my personal opinion. Because you're not creating, you're not contributing to human well-being when you maintain programs that do the complete opposite. And of course, I joined the Environment Department many years ago, at a time when a lot of bush in Saskatchewan was being cleared using government money, and that doesn't create human well-being. In the short term it might, in the long term it doesn't. And to me it's a different way of thinking, and it's also it's a longer term thing. We can actually talk about our children and our grandchildren with this sort of vision, as opposed to, where the hell am I going to get the money from to put the next meal on the table? Which is the classic problem with poverty in the third world, right? People are forced to make non-sustainable decisions.